Hey everyone. So today I want to talk about the collection of essays that came out recently on antinatalism and abortion by Julio Cabrera and Karim Akerma. Now, I read that a couple of days ago, but as you can clearly sense it in my voice, I've been sick, so I couldn't make a video on it. And so if I cough or anything, I apologize. Mm, I'll put the link to the book in the description, but the general idea was that Cabrera was trying to argue that it's possible to be an antinatalist and at the same time be anti-abortion. Now, that was clearly possible already for me, as I am also anti-abortion, but the argument that Cabrera provided and the way that he tried to defend it was very weak for me. So I will try to point out a couple of problems with that. And then Karim Akerma comes in with a little bit more, with a stronger position, sharper metaphysics. However, there are a couple of points and controversial points about his position that I will also explain. And if I have time in the end, I will also try to explain my own perspective into the problem once again. All right, so excuse me. So Julio Cabrera starts by providing a kind of existentialist viewpoint of the entity in when someone is pregnant, the entity inside the woman's body. And by having that kind of existential philosophy, he points out that as a society, as moral agents, we can decide to give, even though that thing does not have a first person autonomy, we can actually give it a second or a third person autonomy. In other words, we should not manipulate that thing because that thing existence is its own thing to be manipulated. So he should finish his own work, he should finish his own projects to decide what he wants to be, what it wants to be. So that manipulation in his existence is something that's his job, not ours. And we should give that kind of autonomy to that existence. So in that framework, we can see how he sees abortion as a bad thing because it's a manipulation. If we are awake, then we have the first person autonomy in addition to that second and third. If you're asleep or in a coma, then we still have that second or third autonomy. So yeah, that's basically the general argument. It's a very weak one because he says that, okay, if you're an antinatalist, then it's possible to provide an argument with this assumption that if we are this society, if we adopt this kind of existentialist viewpoint, then we can decide to give that kind of autonomy to that person, to that embryo or fetus, and that would make it wrong. But even then, at the conclusion, it's not strong enough because he again has this kind of negative arguments and negative, the second degree morality, that even though it's something immoral, that doesn't mean that we cannot do it. Which I don't know. I wasn't really following what that means. But that's just different meta ethics that we're working with. And even after all of this, he has this kind of pessimistic view that there's not much point in arguing about these things and this thing can go on forever. So his project is just saying that, hey, it's possible, and that's the end of it. So even though I agree with the conclusion, I really don't see the way that he argues. It's not strong enough. And then Karim Akerma comes in with a stronger point, clearly attacking the fact that Cabrera's argument is weak in a sense that we have to decide to give that autonomy. Then why should we do that? And he tries to basically fill in that weakness by providing his own metaphysics. But he has much bigger problems here. Because first he starts by distinguishing between organisms and living beings. And that's something that I subscribe to it too. I wouldn't call them living beings, I would call them persons. And instead of organisms, I would call them bodies. But that's fine, so we can work with it. So he says that we are living beings, And we have our bodies as the biological organism that basically constitutes us. Now, the first problem that we immediately see is what happens when we go to sleep, or when we are we're in an embryo, or we go into a coma. Now, in the part of objections to his metaphysics, he says that I don't have any problem with intermittent non-existence or interrupted existence. But that's intermittent non-existence is a notorious metaphysical idea. Even for artifacts, it's a huge issue. And the problem is with the identity of these substances when they go out of existence and come back. And it's notorious because if you think about it, it's very counterintuitive. What Akerma is basically saying is that when we go to sleep, we go out of existence. We don't exist. This is not like a figure of speech. This is not just a metaphor. We don't exist. Like if I ask you, does Aristotle exist? You would say, no, he doesn't exist. So that's the exact same thing that happens to you when you go to sleep. You just don't exist. In our ontology, you don't exist. But then you come back. The problem is, how do we explain the identity of these two substances? I'm not saying that, how do we know that they're the same? Even if we assume that they're exactly the same, how do we explain that? Because there is no continuity here. I also know that we cannot use the identity of the organism here, because that's the whole point, that the living being is a distinct entity from that organism. So it should have its own identity condition independent of the organism, but it can't. So that's a very difficult idea to imagine that we can go out of existence and come back. But even if we put that aside, say, okay, let's find you found a way to formulate that identity condition and explain how it is that something can go out of existence and comes back, and it's exactly the same thing. The problem that I still see is, why is it that we cannot destroy the organism that is in coma or is sleeping? Because we're not killing anyone in those cases. So Akerma talks about reconstructed autonomy when he's trying to point out, to basically confirm the third person autonomy that Cabrera was talking about. And there he talks about this case that when someone is in a coma, for example. And then, and I want to quote here something here. He says that, quote, "It seems to me that this concept makes sense where he speaks of a reconstructed autonomy, referring to the following cases. He or she is in a coma, or seriously ill, or because she is very old or very young, or because he or she died, etc. In the above-mentioned cases, we're dealing with people who are living or have lived, and who have or had desires or goals." So I'm trying to understand what he's trying to say about that person who is in a coma, for example, as he mentions is here, or someone goes to sleep. Because to me, we have an organism in the same sense that when we have a fetus, we have an organism based on Akerma. And we can kill that organism, that embryo, because it's just an organism. There is no living being there. In the case of someone sleeping, we also have an organism, but there's no living being. So how come that we can kill one of them, but we cannot kill the other one? And it seems that this part, which is on the page 41 at the end of the page, should provide an answer to that question. Now, what I'm expecting is this kind of reconstructed autonomy, the way that I can understand it, is that when I exist, based on Akerma's metaphysics, when I exist, for example, I exist right now, I have an autonomy, right? Because we are giving persons, living beings, an autonomy. We should not kill them. Then I can understand that right now I will give a kind of autonomy to my body, to the organism that I have. Why? Because if you kill that organism, if you destroy it, not kill, because Akerma says you can't kill an organism, but if you destroy this organism, you will kill me. So that's killing me, right? So that we can see how my existence can give autonomy to my body. But when I'm sleeping, not I'm not sleeping, but when the organism is there in that state of sleep, there is no one. So where does that organism gets the autonomy? Because if we destroy that organism, we're not killing anyone. I repeat, so when you're asleep, based on Akerma's metaphysics, if we destroy that organism, we're not killing anyone. Because if we ask, who are we killing? There's no answer to that. So, in this line that he's talking about it, I believe he's trying to say something like this, that even though that organism, there is nothing there, but we can still reconstruct an autonomy based on prior existence of a living being. Because before that, there was a living being there. Now, that on itself is problematic, because why should we? Why should we assign an autonomy to an organism right now? Because a living being existed some time ago. As I said, I can explain in that sense on the same time I can give autonomy to my body, but why should I give it to the organism in the future? I don't understand that. But this line also has a couple of problems. He says that in the above mentioned cases, and I'm quoting, we are dealing with people. Well, first of all, here's the first problem. We're dealing with people. If by people he means living beings or persons, which I guess is the common sense use of the word people, then that's false, because we're not dealing with people when we are in the coma case. Okay? So he mentions this list of different cases, and he says that in above mentioned cases, we are dealing with this part, right? So I assume that the coma case, at least one of these parts of these conjunctions should apply to the coma case, because he is including it. So first of all, in the coma case, we're not dealing with people, right? If by people we mean persons, because we're dealing with only with an organism. There is no person there by Akerma's metaphysics. But nonetheless, let's continue. He says we're dealing with people who are living or have lived, but the organism is not living and has never lived, again by Akerma's metaphysics. The organism is not living, and it cannot be killed. So what we are dealing with there in the coma case is not living and has never lived, because that's the living thing that's living. And who have or had desires and goals. But again, the organism that we are dealing with when we have a coma case never has and never had desires and goals. Because it's the living being again. It's the person who has desires and goals. And so yeah, in the reconstructed autonomy part that he talks about, he says in the above mentioned cases we're dealing with that. We're not dealing with any of those cases that he mentions, for example, in a coma place for a person who's in a coma. So I don't know how he applies this reconstructed autonomy to the case of a coma case. So yeah, that's a huge problem. That's a problem that I had even before this paper with got a pro-choice position, that somehow when we go to sleep or we are in the coma, we do not have this permission to destroy an organism, but for an embryo we do have such a case. Another point is, it seems it's not that important, but it's very interesting that he only looks into the past. He says people who are living or have lived or have or had desire. It seems that future is not important, but I guess it should be important, because if you go into a coma and we basically postpone that coming out of the coma, then that's basically indistinguishable from a case of a brain death. And I believe in the case of a brain death, Akerma would want to say that the person ceases to exist at that moment. But if you want to give reconstructed autonomy based on what has been happening in before, prior to that event, then even if brain death happens, we still have autonomy. The organism is still there, and the organism still has autonomy. So we should not declare that person as dead or do something with its body. But he didn't say much about brain death, so I'm not going into details about it. So as I said, it's just even though it's a sharper metaphysics, it's much more clear than Cabrera's position, but it's very complicated, and there are ideas in it which are very difficult to defend. More specifically, why can't I destroy the organism? Because I'm not killing anyone based on Akerma's position. So how do I see it? So for me, the easiest solution, the obvious solution to this thing is that we do not go out of existence when we go to sleep. The personhood and person is a kind of thing, we should assume here, that can persist through stages of not being non-consciousness or unconsciousness. I can go to sleep, I'm still there, and I wake up. I persist through it. And of course, if we create a continuity of personhood here, then we should also give the same thing to an embryo or to a fetus or to a zygote. So we basically have this full continuum of personhood, no intermittent non-existence, no interrupted existence here happening. We just have from the beginning, when you come into existence from the moment of conception until you die, you are a person. You are this kind of thing, which is a person, which is not identical with the organic body that we have, the same way that Akerma would agree. But we have the body. So we are the person, we have the body. We're not identical, so it's kind of a dualistic vision, not Cartesian dualistic, like an immaterial thing. It's a naturalistic, non-Cartesian dualism. And I wouldn't even say that we are constituted by the body. We should say that we have the body. There are arguments defending that kind of viewpoint. And it's us who thinks and desires and has a will and has rationality. I guess I forgot to say that why can't Akerma says that it's the organism that has desires and goals. Why can't the organism also has desire to goal to give an autonomy to that organism? The problem with that is that the desires and goals that we're referring to are the desires and goals of the person or the living being. So if the organism also has those desires and goals, then we will have the problem of basically two thinkers here. We have the living being having those desires, and at the same time we also have the organism having exactly the same desires. We have two different entities at the same time having the same desire, which will explode into problems in metaphysics. So I believe that we are persons, right? We have these bodies, and so the desires are ours. Our bodies do not have those desires that we have. So it's our thinking, it's our will. Now it's a natural explanation. So if we go back in time, so obviously there was a time that we didn't have any living being, we didn't have any plants, we didn't have any animals. But then as we go on, different kinds of things come into existence, and some hundreds of thousands of years ago, I don't know the history of it, that's for science to determine, a new kind of thing comes into existence, and that's persons. So persons are those who have a kind of self-consciousness. They have thoughts, they're aware, they have a self, so they can refer to themselves. They have thoughts and rationality, reason, and will. So that's the new kind of thing that comes into existence. And these things have bodies. They have biological bodies, but they're different kinds of things. Now, I can understand that the reason that Akerma goes for that kind of metaphysics, that the person, the living being, should go out of existence when they do not experience a consciousness, is because if we have, for example, an animal that, let's say by assumption, is not a living thing, it's not a person, then if we go back, for example, in the fetus or embryo state of both of them, and we look at them, then we cannot really distinguish between them. Because, first of all, they usually look the same, but even more importantly, none of them has a state of consciousness. So that animal, who's not a person, does not have a consciousness, and this human being embryo also doesn't have still a consciousness. So they look exactly the same. So the problem is that, I guess, Akerma tries to prevent this leaking of personhood and living to other entities. Because if we can be a person without being conscious, as we are when we are an embryo, then why can't we say that, for example, a plant also, if you're assuming that they're not a person, why can't we assume that they don't have a consciousness, but they're still a person? Why can't we say that? Now, the answer to the question is that we are just different kinds of things. So if we have a person, so that human being is a person, is a kind person, but that animal is not a person. So even though that those two embryos look exactly the same, the problem of being indistinguishable here is an epistemological problem for us. It's not an ontological problem. Those two embryos are different kinds of things. To understand this, for example, let's look at another example. Let's say we have a cat and we have a dog. And we're looking at the zygote and in the embryo of these two things, a cat and a dog. Now, if you look at those embryos, again, they look the same. But how do we distinguish between them? How do we say, okay, one of them is a dog, the other one is a cat? Well, the thing is that they are different kinds of things. Someone might say, okay, how do you know that? And I say, okay, because they are different natural laws is being applied to these different kinds. And if someone says, okay, how do you know that? How do you know that different natural law is applying to that kind and to this one? The only way to see that is just to wait and see. Because if we wait, we will see that this embryo will turn into a dog and the other one will turn into a cat, which means that there are different laws governing that embryo, which was because they were from different kinds of things. So in the same sense, for the embryo of the human being and that animal, which by hypothesis does not have a personhood, even though they look the same, it's not an ontological problem because they're of different kinds of things, because they're under different natural laws. And how do we know that? We just have to wait and see, because if we wait long enough, we see that the embryo will turn actually into a person, but that animal will not turn into a person by assumption. So we don't have any problem. There's no worry there. Okay, there's no problem there. We can have this personhood persisting through our whole life without being conscious. Okay, so of course in normal cases, if you go into extreme cases, then we can talk about it. For example, if someone never gains consciousness, do we really want to call that person alive at any point, or are we going to just say that they're dead completely? I would assume that we can still say that they are still a person. Now, what kind of points can we have here? Okay, so the other thing that I have to insist here. Now, the problem is clear, but I want to insist on this point. So if we are one person during our whole life, if I'm a person and that gives my body an autonomy, basically, we cannot destroy my body because that will kill me. In the same sense, an embryo is also a person. It's not conscious, but it's a person that has a body. And that embryo, that human embryo, is his or her body. So even if you go to a zygote, again, we have a person, and the zygote is his or her body. So in the same sense, that if you kill my body right now, you are killing, if you destroy, by Akerma's terminology, if you destroy my body, you will kill me. In the same sense, and that's the wrong thing to do, in the same sense, if we kill the embryo, we are destroying the body of a person, therefore killing it. in the same for a zygote. Because some people might claim, okay, it's just a couple of cells, but this distinction has to be made, because the couple of cells for zygote, just one cell, and for embryo, or even where you are like just like 10 cells, that's the whole body. So if you destroy that 1 or 2 cell, that's all there is for that person to exist. So if you destroy those 2 cells, that's destroying a person's body, therefore ending their life. So it's exactly the same thing as destroying this body and killing this person. So if you're respecting this one, then we should also respect that one. I believe that's a very clear, robust way of looking at it. There's no like very controversial idea in it, like the intermittent non-existence. And I believe it's very consistent with the way that even our intuition works here. So yeah, I hope so that kind of clarifies my position, also my viewpoint about the papers. Cheers.